Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 219. This time I'm going to talk about Cal Tjader's album from 1960, Demasiado Caliente, on Fantasy Records. This is a first mono pressing, produced as many Fantasy releases were, on red vinyl, on which I am not sophisticated enough orally to have an opinion. This early release has a cover which I suspect that YouTube will not allow me to use as a thumbnail. And incidentally, have you ever seen a gloomier looking naked person on a record cover? I think there has to be a story there. In terms of what to expect, this is, as is typical of Tjader from this point in his career, Latin jazz of very high quality. It's one of his last releases for Fantasy, where he had spent pretty much the whole of the decade and he'd reinvented himself, moving away from his original cool jazz roots, playing with Desmond and Brubeck, to reinvent himself really as a top-rank Latin player. Cal Tjader was born in 1925 to Swedish-American parents who were vaudeville performers, and their home base was in St. Louis. But when he was young, they settled in San Mateo, California, and his parents opened up a tap dance studio. His dad was a dancer, his mom was a musician, and the combination of these two leads to him becoming, in his earliest professional entertainment incarnation, a tap dancing prodigy in and around the Bay Area. His mom taught him the piano, but he had a very strong rhythmic sense, always did throughout his career, and quite soon began to pick up the drums and other kinds of rhythmic instruments along the way. He enlists in 1943. He serves as a medic throughout the Pacific Theater, and he sees a ton of action. He's basically involved in all kinds of the major actions of the Pacific War. When he's demobilized after the war, he decides to become a teacher originally, so he enrolls at San Jose State College, but he's still got the music bug pretty bad, and he transfers to San Francisco State, and there he starts to learn the timpani. At San Francisco State, Tjader meets the pianist Dave Brubeck, who's just out of the army himself. Brubeck has another friend with a lot of musical talent, the alto saxophonist Paul Desmond, and the three of them decide to form a jazz group, the Dave Brubeck Octet. Now, the Octet releases one record, which doesn't move a lot of copies. It kind of sounds like what it was, basically a group of beginners, although a very talented group of beginners. Anyway, like I said, it didn't move a lot of copies, and so the group disbands. Brubeck and Tjader, however, decide they still want to work together. They form a trio under Brubeck's name, the Dave Brubeck Trio, and they began to play the Bay Area to much greater levels of success. Around this time, Tjader, of course, is drumming, but he's teaching himself to play the vibes. This is, of course, the instrument with which he'd be most associated later on. I reviewed previously a record by the Dave Brubeck Trio, which compiled a bunch of tracks that were recorded around 1951. The difference between the octet sound and this sound, just a couple of years later, is marked, much more sophisticated. Tjader is switching between vibes, drums, and bongos. He's triple threat. Anyway, very interesting listen. But then the hand of fate intervenes, and Brubeck gets quite badly injured in a diving accident in Hawaii, which lays him up for many months, and the trio's got to disband. Tjader then starts another trio with a guy called Jack Weeks, who played bass in the octet, and a piano player called Vince Guaraldi of Charlie Brown fame. With that group, he makes his first record as a leader, finishes up his studies at San Francisco State, and then he gets hired by George Shearing, the piano player and band leader. And it's at this point that Tjader's interest in Latin jazz is really starting to heat up. Another player in Shearing's band, the bass player Al McKibben, is also a huge fan, and they're egging each other on, and they're also egging on Shearing, who Shearing can see the merit, and Tjader adds bongos to the vibes he was already playing for Shearing's group. Shearing's group tours incessantly all the way through the United States, exposing Tjader to all kinds of influences, including in New York, seeing all kinds of Latin jazz, and through seeing Tito Puente's group, he ends up meeting and becoming friendly with two of the key percussionists in Puente's group, Mongo Santamaria and Willie Bobo. The US in the 1950s very much had mambo fever for a variety of reasons. Dizzy Gillespie had caught the Afro-Cuban jazz bug in the 1940s. He'd begun to work with Chano Pozo. Machito created this Cuban big band in New York, which became very popular in the 1940s as well. Then in the 1950s, you got Xavier Cugat, you've got Tito Puente, you've got Perez Prado, all over American dance floors and in very high demand. In 1954, Tjader makes his first out-and-out Latin jazz record for Fantasy Records. Tjader plays Afro-Cuban. He then leaves Shearing's band that April and forms the Cal Tjader Modern Mambo Quintet. As a sign of how serious this tap-dancing child of Swedish-American vaudevillians was about adopting Latin music as his preferred medium of expression, all of his original recruits into the quintet were Latino musicians. Over the next few years, Tjader molds us into an incredible band. There were a few lineup changes, but all the way through, he had players who could both play straight-ahead jazz, but also Latin jazz and just flat-out Latin music and move fluidly and easily between these styles. He records a ton, making something like a dozen Latin jazz records for Fantasy in this period, plus a handful of straight-ahead jazz records. He was commercially successful, but you wouldn't say he was commercial. He was very much committed to legit Latin music. By the time he'd be able to recruit Bobo and Santamaria themselves into his group in 1958, he'd established serious musical cred in the Latin music world, such that if you're trying to buy his records from that particular period, it's actually kind of hard to buy them from North America. You actually have to buy them from South American sellers. So well did they sell in Colombia and Venezuela and other places. This record is near the end of this run, and soon after this release, he moves to Verve, where he begins to work with Creed Taylor, and his output starts to vary more greatly, but that's another story. This record was made sometime in 1960. It's kind of unclear when, largely due to Tjader's prolific recording schedule. It's a strange album for a couple of reasons. One, it combines 5 live tracks recorded at the Black Hawk Club in San Francisco with 4 studio tracks recorded in LA. The other weird thing about it is the sequencing, because these are all broken up. You don't get one side of live and another side of studio. They alternate, and there's a slightly different feel, as you might imagine, to the different performances. The band at the Black Hawk was a sextet, and it's comprised of Cal Tjader. He's credited only for vibes, but he also plays a variety of percussion instruments here. Mongo Santamaria on congas, Willie Bobo on timbales, Jose Luzano on flute, Victor Villegas on bass, and Lonnie Hewitt on piano. In LA, Tjader, Santamaria, and Bobo return, but they're joined by 4 others. Modesto Brizeno on flute and alto sax, Tony Taran on trumpet, Tjader's old friend from the Shearing Band, Al McKibben, on bass, and Eddie Cano on piano. The record starts with one of the tracks from the Black Hawk performance, Manila, which is a song written by Mongo Santamaria. It starts as a breezy little flute number, but then it gains some real heft as the percussionists start to insert themselves. Key Largo is the first studio track, and that's next. This is actually kind of a sedate number. It's the first time we hear Tjader's vibes properly. It's a beautifully produced track, as you might expect, but it doesn't have a lot of zip. However, now we're back in the club for Tumbao, which is probably the best track on the record and a really, really great track. It's also quite long, about 7 minutes. His percussionists that he picked up, Santamaria and Bobo, were basically top of their game in the whole Latin music world at the time, and they are to the fore here with the extended dual solo that raises the temperature about 400 degrees. You can hear the crowd responding. It's fantastic music. We're back in the studio for the last track on side 1, Blue Dan, and this is actually much, much better. The energy level is way higher. Side 2 starts with another one of the studio tracks, Chispita, which is by Cano. This has a kind of a carefree big band feel, the kind of music that you might imagine the crowd at Michael Corleone's Lake Tahoe resort might enjoy. We're then back in the club with September Song, which is a lovely down-tempo track, a studio track, Cal's Pal, which is kind of a resting point between post-war big band jazz and Latin music. This is something more to appeal to Michael Corleone's guests. The last 2 tracks are in the club, starting with Parati, which is by Santamaria. This starts off with the bass, accompanied by percussion. It's a percussion-heavy track almost all the way through, and has a lot of great moments, particularly this lovely descending riff at the end. The final track is Mum Blues, which is by Tjader. Starts off okay, the melody's fine, but then it just kicks into a whole other gear when you get this conga and timbales break by Santamaria and Bobo, which is just awesome. And then when Villegas comes in on bass, it's actually a really thrilling moment on this record, a really high note to end. Tjader's Latin output is copious, and it's wise to pick and choose. I don't know if there's any one album you'd say is flawless, but what does push this record into the top tier of his fantasy releases is the incredible quality of his percussionists. Anything after 1958 in that string has got that high quality of percussion. There are several great tracks here, particularly, but not exclusively, from the live set. And this is as good a record to start with as any in Tjader's Latin output. I'd give it 4 out of 5 stars.